as a concession to us that it's wrong to think of the ecumenical councils or the papacy in the first millennium just sort of pronouncing dogmas. He admits it didn't really work that way, and this is one of the key points. This is probably the most controversial section of the book, where he admits the orthodox point. Now, I'm gonna make this big because everybody copes over this. This is the cope text, so let's make the screen really big. And you can screenshot this. I'm going to get it right for you so you can see the actual text. There you go. Screenshot that bad boy right there. It's a big old fat footnote from Ratzinger. Und Ratzinger. Okay. Going to give you guys a second to read it. Now, you can all imagine immediately what the Roman Catholics say. This was a footnote. It doesn't matter. It doesn't count. Well, first of all, pretty sure that when the Vatican censored people in the past, right, like the Holy Office, when it used to censor people, did they have an out by saying, well, this is my private theological opinion, so I'm not susceptible to any of your critiques, right? Is that a way? Is that an out for anybody in the past? In terms of when the Holy Office would put books under censure? Do you realize that this is a comment that is almost mirror to things that Ignaz von Dollinger argued at the time of Vatican I? I mean, you could find Dollinger basically saying the exact same thing as Ratzinger says in this footnote. Was Dollinger allowed to have his free private opinion about the fact that the Vatican I view of the papacy was not present in the first 1,000 years? No, he was not. So most of the cope outs that we hear from Roman Catholics to explain away this footnote don't work with their own holy offices' critiques and going after books and putting them on the banned book list, on the index, right? So let's read the actual quote and see what Ratzinger says. It's tiny. I can barely read this. Let's see what it says. What is particularly fatal about the attempt in terms of having what he calls a fundamentalist idea that you just pronounce a dogma, right? Like Rome or a council pronounces a dogma, is the misunderstanding of the concept of dogma upon which this rests. Schulenburg understood dogma entirely from a narrow point of view of the Jesuit dogmatic theology at the end of the 19th century, and naturally it looks in vain for a magisterial dogmatic pronouncement relating to the virgin birth, analogous to what we have in terms of dogmatization of the Immaculate Conception. So he's saying that it's wrong to think in the first millennium that we would have a dogmatic ex cathedra statement for the virgin birth like we have in more recent times as Roman Catholics for the Immaculate Conception, he says. Freedom from original sin, in other words, he's explaining what it means, and the physical assumption of Mary into heaven. He thus comes to the conclusion that in the matter of the birth of Jesus from the Virgin, as opposed to the other two statements, our firm teaching by the church, extant in reality, I can barely see this. In reality, such assertion turns the history of dogma upside down and attributes absoluteness to a mode of exercising teaching function only regularly in use since Vatican I. So in other words, you can't expect in the first millennium the exercising of the teaching function of the papacy to exist as it does after Vatican I. That alone is an amazing admission right there. Okay, and then he goes on to say, thus, it is unacceptable not only in view of the dialogue with the Orthodox churches, the Eastern churches, but also from the very nature of the matter itself. And even Schulenburg himself does not think it through thick and thin. In fact, dogma as a single tenet proclaimed by the Pope ex cathedra is the latest and lowest way of forming dogma. So papal ex cathedras are late and they're low, according to this text. The original form in which the church states her faith in a binding fashion is the creed. Remember, Michael Lofton did a whole stream laughing, saying that you could start by understanding dogma according to the creed. Oh, well, that's what Ratzinger says, goober. The confession of the laity in the birth of Jesus from the Virgin, he says, is a simple, basic starting point for dogma. And that's how the early church understood dogma. Now, he's going to make another fascinating statement as well as we move on, where he talks about, I think that's in a separate book where he admits that the operation of the papacy in the second millennium was not the exact same as it was in the first millennium. So two different famous statements from Ratzinger. But that's an admission of our point. And as I just said on Twitter the other day, I mean, imagine you're a Christian in the year 320 AD, right? There has been no ecumenical councils yet. We are almost 300 years removed from the life of Christ, 320 AD. We don't have any direct access to Rome, right? Christianity has spread throughout the Roman Empire. Many famous church fathers and martyrs all throughout the Roman Empire. Many apostolic and apostolic succession-based sees all around. How does a Christian in this situation know dogma? Now, remember, according to the mainline normie apologists like Lofton and these people, the only way to know dogma is to refer to Rome. Where's the list? But everybody knows, it should be obvious, that in 320 AD, hardly anybody had direct access to Rome or some list of what they have to believe from Rome, except something like the Creed, which Ratzinger uses as his own very example, which is the very thing that Michael Lofton laughs at when he says that you can't use the Creed as an example of knowing dogma. But again, knowing dogma for the first 300 years of Christianity could in no way reference simple looking to Rome or simply going to an ecumenical council. This alone refutes the idea that knowing dogma is somehow magically solved or given to you via some office of a papacy. And all of the argumentation that I just gave you earlier about Constantinople I also disproves this argument. How did a council called out of communion with Rome correctly define the dogma of the Trinity, and the saint of that council dies out of communion with Rome, and then Rome retroactively accepts the council? So did it become Holy Spirit inspired when it was happening and taught correctly? In which case Rome isn't necessary, and that's an admission that Rome is not necessary for doctrinal purity and doctrinal fidelity. Or did it only become ecumenical and Holy Spirit inspired after the facts, ex post facto, which is absurd on its face? So Rome's acceptance makes a thing inspired. And this seems to be kind of what Lofton and these people are now arguing, which is completely ridiculous. Ex post facto, decades or a century or centuries later, Palamos is made into a saint. So essentially the papacy makes truth and falsehood, makes history. He makes facts and truth to go with this absurd line of reasoning.